All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm excited to get started. Well, 2020, the world changed in a lot of ways, as I think we all know, and this was certainly felt in college admissions too. So tonight, we're going to talk about what specifically has changed in the last year, how this may impact your application process, and what you can do to navigate these changes and maximize your outcome. So with that, let's begin. Okay, so you're probably wondering a little bit more about who we are. Why should you even be listening to us tonight? So by way of introduction, let me begin. I'm Lindsay. I'm Logic Prep's founder and CEO. Personally, my background is in writing and storytelling. I was an English major at Harvard, and my deep interest in narrative and in stories has informed my approach to advising students, which I've been doing for the past 14 years. I help students tell their stories through the classes they take, the extracurriculars that they pursue, and the essays that they write. And I feel really fortunate to lead a team of advisors, tutors, and essay coaches that have helped thousands of students submit successful applications all around the world. Our college advisors, all of whom are former admissions officers from top schools such as Harvard and Stanford and Duke and Georgetown and UVA, they bring more than 60 years of collective experience evaluating over 75,000 applications and deep insight into the higher education landscape to help students find the best fit schools for them. So with that, I'm excited to introduce you to two of our incredible advisors who are joining me tonight, Carrie and Megan. And with that, Carrie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Hanrahan. I am the Director of College Advising here at Logic Prep. And I've spent my whole professional career in the world of access and education, providing access to college and then also providing access to careers. I started as a high school college counselor, then an admission professional for 4 years at Colorado College. And then last, I helped students identify their passions so that they could land full-time lucrative jobs when I was a career counselor. While I was at Colorado College, I also taught a class called Social Entrepreneurship, which gives me the foundation for coaching my Logic Prep students on how to make an impact in their local communities. Thanks. With that, I'll turn it over to Megan.
Thank you, Carrie. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be with you tonight. My name is Megan. I have spent my entire life on college campuses around the Northeast and New England. So I grew up as the daughter of an American college football coach and college administrator. So I really mean that, like deep into the campus cultures at a bunch of different schools. So this is really the family biz for me. We talked about college at the dinner table every day. I went off to college, of course. I went to Williams College for undergrad and then got my graduate degree at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. After college, my first job naturally was as a college counselor. And then I worked at colleges and universities around the world, including spending 6 years at Harvard in admissions and financial aid. And Lindsay, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so you've probably all seen the headlines this past year about the record low college acceptance rates, and it really makes this process seem scary. But I promise it's really not that bad when you know what's going on. And I want to actually, with that in mind, take a step back to talk about what the college application process really entails outside of the craziness of this past year. So basically, the college admissions process is founded upon 3 main pillars. Let me explain. The first pillar is the academic record. So that's essentially your transcript and its rigor. It's the classes you're taking and how you perform in them. The next pillar is your standardized testing. So that's the SAT or the ACT, and we would advise students to take one, not both, and maximize their outcome in that particular test. And then the third piece is the personal narrative. It's your activities, it's how you spend your summers, your teacher recommendations. It's really what makes you who you are. So let me say this, reflecting on this past year, these pillars still stand. though it's true, some may be a little bit shakier than they've been in the past. And what I'm going to demonstrate tonight is that the weight or emphasis of each of these pillars has changed more than the foundations themselves this past year. And that has some real implications for students, and that's what we're going to go ahead and discuss. Okay, so take a look at this chart. The light blue represents the number of applicants for the class of 2024, and the dark blue represents the number of applicants for the class of 2025. So in other words, the students who applied during COVID. Now imagine you were applying to Columbia 2 years ago. You were one of 40,000 applicants. That's a pretty big pool, no? Well, this past admission cycle, you were up against 60,000 other students, even bigger. And clearly it's not just Columbia. Take MIT, for example. Applications were up this year 66%. Now, I want to emphasize that this phenomenon is unique to highly selective schools. You'll notice the names we have highlighted here. These are some of the most competitive schools in the country. And when we say highly selective schools, what we're talking about is schools with acceptance rates under 30%. So in any case, we're going to talk a little bit more about why this trend pertains specifically to these kinds of universities. We will get to that, but for now, I mean, these numbers are just staggering. Okay, this brings us to this year's record low acceptance rates. And this part's a little bit more obvious, right? Because as we just illustrated, schools saw many more applicants than they did in the past. And it's not as if colleges expanded the number of seats that they had. In fact, there were actually even fewer seats at many universities this past admission cycle because of the number of students who deferred their admissions due to gap years during the COVID pandemic. So let's talk a little bit more about what's going on here and why. Simply put, the pond expanded. It's not that you're a smaller fish per se, it's just that the pond got way bigger. But there's one thing in particular that I want to point out. Only 2.4 more students applied, but applications were up 11%. So what does this mean? Basically, this set of numbers says that the increase in applications came from students applying to more schools rather than more students applying overall. Why is this? Why were students applying to so many more schools? This can partially be explained by the idea of increased access. So this year in particular, colleges were able to expand their reach by recruiting online. And this is something that we expect is going to continue. Basically, admissions representatives who historically would visit high schools all around the world to share what was so special about their schools didn't need to do that anymore. They would host online info sessions. At the same time, colleges rolled out some really impressive online resources for students, like virtual tours, where they could explore schools online without ever hopping on a plane, much like those regional reps who didn't visit anymore. At the same time, students felt compelled to apply to more schools. Because they couldn't visit in person, it was harder to determine their favorites. How can you really know? And unsurprisingly, the increased stress and anxiety that so many of us were feeling for so many reasons really drove the impulse to apply to more schools. Finally, when we think about this increased number of applications, the rise of test optional admissions cannot be underestimated. During the pandemic, almost every school in the US had to go test optional, meaning they wouldn't require SAT or ACT scores as a temporary accommodation for students, since the test just kept getting canceled. Students couldn't actually take the tests in their centers. So as a result, students or applicants didn't feel constrained by the test score ranges, and more students were open to the possibility of applying to highly selective schools than ever before. In a sense, it's like the lock on the front gate appeared to be loosened at the most competitive universities. Since test scores no longer stood as a barrier to entry, more students felt emboldened to apply. Now, this seems like a big shift, but I want to remind you, the criteria for evaluating students hasn't fundamentally changed. It's just that the weight assigned to each category has. The process has become more subjective and less quantifiable. As we just talked about, test scores were optional, transcripts were less reliable. In this past year with online schooling, more classes were going pass fail. It was just a little bit harder to know what was going on in school. And plus, there were even limitations on extracurriculars with fewer avenues to demonstrate leadership and passion in a more traditional sense. Now think about this. More applications being submitted plus less data available to the schools basically means more work for admissions officers and in turn, potentially less thoughtful decision-making. It's not like admissions officers suddenly had more time to evaluate applications this last year. So it's a bit of a double whammy. More so than ever, you have to do more to stand out. Okay, so as we think a bit more about this data that's generally available to admissions officers, we've been discussing test scores quite a bit. So I want to dive further into this particular piece of the holistic admissions picture. First, we're going to define some terms. What is test optional? In a test optional environment, SAT or ACT scores are not required, but they are considered if they're submitted. So that's what pertains to the vast majority of schools this past year. Then there's something different, which is called test blind. At a test blind schools, SAT or ACT scores are not evaluated at all. Even if you submit them, nobody's looking at them. Very few colleges fit into this category. Notably, however, the University of California system, so UCLA and UC Berkeley, did go test blind this year. Now, we should think about the upcoming 2021 admission cycle as an extension of 2020 in some ways. More schools are offering test optional admissions as a temporary continued adjustment to their policies. Now, we have to acknowledge that this past admission cycle and the coming one that we're about to enter are functioning as a pretty massive experiment. What does it mean for colleges to no longer require test scores to be test optional? And the reality is we don't know yet, but I do think at many schools, the option will remain. The option, I should say, to not submit test scores will remain, especially at schools that have been contemplating this shift prior to COVID. But despite some of these policies that remain in flux, I want to talk about why test scores still matter. At the end of the day, test scores are one more component for admissions officers to evaluate, and they're a concrete one. Scores contextualize grades. Transcripts, as we all know, are variable, and not every school all over the world is known to the admissions officers who are reading applications. I would say that SAT and ACT scores, for that reason, are especially important for international students when the schools or grading systems are less universally understood to the individuals who are going to be reading them. They're also really important for students from selective high schools anywhere, where the local competition is especially intense. And anecdotally, I'll point out that our most successful students applying to the most selective schools this year did have strong testing. We've talked a lot about the admissions landscape. Now, let's get to you. De-emphasizing testing means that other subjective factors, such as your essay, your teacher recommendations, and your leadership, are going to matter more. So what can you do? The first thing I want to talk about is ways to demonstrate academic rigor. Our advisors guide students on selecting genuinely challenging course loads. We want all of our students to take the most rigorous courses available to them and do well in them, achieve the strongest grades that they can. With this in mind, AP testing for the students who have access to that is even more important than ever as an extension of the academic curriculum and a standardized marker of achievement. Also in this category are teacher recommendations, specifically from 10th and 11th grade teachers. Those teachers should be able to speak to your engagement in class, your development as a student, so that they they can speak really specifically about how proactive you are about participating or seeking out extra support or going deeper with the material. All of that speaks to academic rigor and engagement. There are even opportunities to pursue rigor outside of your classes and to show investment in learning in more novel ways. So summer courses fit into that category. You can enroll in AP classes outside of school or take online college classes for credit through platforms like Coursera or edX. We also encourage our students to create an intentional and strategic SAT or ACT testing plan. Now, the first step is to identify whether the SAT or ACT is going to be a better fit for you, to set goals, and then to evaluate how your testing is going to fit within the larger context of your application process. And this is exactly what our academic and test prep advisors do. As students progress through their practice testing, we advise that they think about their standardized testing on a really school by school basis. What may be an additive score in one context may not contribute to the strength of your application in another. So these are going to be really nuanced conversations and decisions around how testing is going to fit into the bigger picture. This is a big one, developing the compelling personal narrative. I have a lot to say about this, and this is exactly what our essay coaches do in collaboration with our college advisors. What is the story you're telling? What is it that makes you uniquely you? That is the personal narrative piece. Your narrative is going to be comprised of the activities you choose, the classes you take, but it's ultimately about what drives your curiosity, what excites you, what makes you want to lean in. To that, I would say do it. The more genuine you can be, the better. This also speaks to the idea of impact, and that's something we're going to explore further in the case studies that Carrie and Megan will present on shortly. How have you demonstrated a depth of commitment and made a difference? We really encourage our students to deeply pursue their interests in creative ways, to take classes online. Now the classes and learning have become available to the whole world in all sorts of new ways, and to brainstorm projects that reflect their passions and strengths. And specifically, I would say, in this COVID year, there's been a real focus on community impact and making an impact through social engagement. So that's something that we really think about as well when developing the personal narrative. So start mapping this out, honestly, as early as freshman year. It's never too early to begin. And that includes the summers as well. I would even say it's not too early now to start thinking about your essay. Just start jotting down ideas in a notebook or a Google Doc. You never know what could strike you now that could be relevant later. Now, we've talked quite a bit about all the things you can be doing to develop as an individual, but there's also some control that you have over the school list piece of this and the where you apply. Now, we've talked so much about like the craziness of students applying to so many schools, and I am not an advocate of that at all. I really believe in being intentional about where you're applying. I think 10 to 12 schools is a totally appropriate and manageable and reasonable number of schools if you're being thoughtful about what is the balance of targets, safeties, and reaches. And finally, we speak so much to our students about interest and fit when they're constructing those lists of schools. At the end of the day, with more applicants, colleges want to know like who's actually serious about coming here. They're trying to manage their yield and know what to expect, just as much as students are trying to know what to expect. So that's why it's so important to do your research, find the best fit schools for you, and then communicate that to those schools in their essays. That the schools, if they see your enthusiasm, are more likely to want to accept you. So sign up for virtual tours, engage with the schools by registering for their mailing lists, even reach out to your regional representative to ask questions directly. And there's perhaps no greater demonstration of interest than applying early decision to a school. Now, remember, for anyone who doesn't know, early decision is that plan where you pick one school to apply to, and if you get in, you have to go. So that's a real sign of engagement and enthusiasm, and colleges value that in their admissions process as well. So with all of that said, I'm going to turn this over now to Carrie and Megan, who are going to go over some student case studies from this past year to illustrate what it means in action to stand out and how we concretely help students differentiate themselves in this process.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. It's Carrie again. I am extremely excited to introduce you to my New York student who was accepted and will be attending Wake Forest next year. So let me give you some context. Wake Forest is another selective school. This year was the hardest year to get accepted to Wake in history. 28% more applicants, more students applied to Wake Forest this year. So how did this student do it? Let me give you her own characteristics. So she's from New York. She attends a public school and she's an athlete. However, she had no season during COVID-19, as I'm sure many of you can relate to. She had a great GPA, so her academics were definitely there. It's 97 out of 100. And she's an IB diploma candidate. The interesting thing about this student is that she opted not to submit her test scores, which had a little bit of play early on in her confidence when she was building her school list. Okay, now I'm going to talk about her college application specifically, and I'm going to give you two main things that I want to talk about. The first one is that our New York student applied early. So Lindsay finished her last slide with the most important thing you can do to show your interest and your excitement for a college is to apply early decision, that binding contract. And that's what she did. However, we know that at Wake Forest, they have a rolling early decision, which means that once they open their application, you can actually submit it as soon as you want, as soon as you're done, up until the November 1 deadline. And the sooner you admit it, the sooner they will actually read your application, which is something sometimes people don't know about certain schools. So I'm going to repeat that. Rolling admission means that if you submit your application early, then the school will actually read it early. They won't wait until the deadline to read that. And that means that you may get your application in before the vast majority of people apply to that college, which gives you one more edge. So she applied early, and yes, she was accepted, and she applied rolling early decision, and she actually applied in September, whereas most people apply by November 1. And she found out before November 1 that she was accepted into Wake Forest. So she knew her future before most seniors had even applied to college, which is amazing and took quite a lot of stress off of her senior year. The second thing I want to mention is that she really expressed throughout her application her community-driven and impact narrative. So she is a wonderful, typical high achiever, like many of you on this call, and like the majority of the students we work with. And she also really needed to find a way, though, not to just be that typical high achiever. And she wasn't submitting test scores. So we had to work together to figure out how she could bring her own personal narrative into this mix and show a piece of herself that would actually bring her application to the front and also benefit the school and Wake Forest at the same time. So she didn't make an enormous world life-changing ripple effect across the world or the country. However, she did quite a number of small activities and made some actions that were really beneficial to the local community during COVID. And it showed throughout her application that she would invest the same level of effort at Wake Forest with her community there. For example, this is my favorite one. She took in COVID puppies and fostered them until she found them homes. And she also took over a neighborhood food distribution program so that nobody would go hungry during COVID. And when she came to start working with us on her extracurricular list, on her resume, and throughout her essays, this actually wasn't highlighted. And so we worked together to make sure that she would showcase this community impact, to rework what to highlight and elevate that narrative of that local impact she was making to make sure that Wake is 100% that she's going to bring the same level of effort and impact to Wake Forest. So what did we learn? Quick summary. Number one, if Lindsay didn't say it and I didn't say it and Megan doesn't say it, apply early. So she applied early decision 1 and she got in. That shows her interest, and it's incredibly important to the school to show your interest. She also showed her impact because schools want to not just admit students that will attend that show interest, but they want to admit students who will contribute to their community in a really positive way. And that's why her community impact was so important here. And then the second thing, this was an interesting case because she actually didn't have Wake Forest on her school list when she started working with me at Logic Prep. She wasn't sure she could get accepted without test scores. So together, we were able to add Wake, which was a dream school of hers, and adjust her school list to make it very intentional, and also adjust her personal narrative throughout the application to make that acceptance possible. All right, Megan, your turn.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, so I'm going to be sharing with you all tonight a little bit about one of my students who was indeed admitted to Wharton, which is the, I'm sure you're familiar with Wharton. It's the undergraduate business portion of UPenn. It's a favorite, and it was this student's dream school since he was a kid. Similarly, he did apply early decision, so that absolutely factored into the success of this case. The context for you, this is a Brazilian student. So he was an international applicant from a private school in Brazil. And academically, the quantifiable aspects of his academic column, I would say were strong, but not over the top for Wharton. So strong for Wharton is what he had. So top 5% of his class in an AP curriculum. He did have some 6s, which are AP versions of Bs, early on in high school. So in 9th and 10th grade, he had a couple of those, but an upward trajectory, all 7s, all As in 11th and 12th grade. The testing is a big takeaway for this student. Late in the game, he was able to get the mid 1400 score. And he got there after sitting 3 times for the test and studying hard, committed to test prep and committed to having this data point to add to his file, because we knew your transcript is not going to be standout at Wharton. It's not going to keep you out, but it's not going to tip you into the class. So having that additional data point for him was really crucial to help contextualize the transcript, as Lindsay was saying. A strength of his academically was his academic narrative. So he did have a lot of proven interest and experience studying business and applying it. So through his essays, we were really able to get that strength in his academic column, but again, not stand out for Wharton. Where this student was able to stand out and where the strength of his application was in, as Lindsay alluded to, impact, specifically social impact during this pandemic and during COVID. And extracurriculars is something that at Logic Prep, we work with our students on a lot. This is a huge part of our mentoring and all of our work together is building that narrative through the extracurriculars. And also, as Lindsay said, really finding what lights you up and going towards it and doing it. So this student, the second takeaway from this student is really how to take those conversations and execute, and the power of doing so. So he was the founder and CEO of what became a multi-city regional high impact COVID food project, in which he was able to raise tens of thousands of reais and donate tens of thousands of tons of food to people in need. So he really took that and went with it. In addition, he had exceptional school level leadership. He was class president, varsity soccer captain, president of National Honor Society, and more. To summarize, what we can learn from this successful Wharton case, number one is commitment and dedication to the process and to test prep. And the importance at these highly selective universities, especially, of having as many data points as we can give to them, even in a test optional landscape. And secondly, the importance of extracurriculars and large scale impact, and specifically social impact during this time of need. So that is this case for you. And Lindsay, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, so now just allow me to brag for a second on behalf of our students. 90% of our students this year were accepted to one of their top 3 colleges, which is a pretty awesome statistic under any circumstances, but I actually want to point out that it was an even more successful admission season than the year before. So that may surprise you given all that we've talked about tonight. And so why do I think that is? I want to emphasize that I truly believe that while the developments I've described this evening are by no means uncomplicated, the college admissions process has always been characterized by infuriating idiosyncrasies and shifting educational and social influences, or at least that's been the case for as long as I've been advising students. And yes, the changes are on a broader and potentially more disruptive scale than what we've seen in the past, but we're well equipped to illuminate both what is changing in this process and what's not, and to help you craft and tell your story and to answer the question of who you are, what you can contribute, and who you want to be. So let me just jump ahead to this list of acceptances. These are the schools where our students were accepted this year, and I'm just so proud to highlight their accomplishments, to celebrate them, and to just think about what all that's in store for their next steps. So with that in mind, I'm always available to talk one-on-one and answer any questions related to the college admissions process. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, and same goes for Megan and Carrie, so I'm including their information here. So I also want to thank you all. Many of you submitted questions in advance of tonight's presentation. So we're going to dive into some of those. Carrie and Megan are going to take that away. And in the meantime, if you have any questions that have occurred to you from the presentation, feel free to chat those over in the Q&A box and we will address them this evening.
Thanks so much. So Lindsay, I can take this away. We had a couple pre-submitted questions, and so I will read one out to make sure that we're all aware of what's being asked and what we would advise as well. And please, I would very much say, definitely write your questions down in the chat box, and Megan and I will take them as they come. So I think the most common question we've been asked in the past few weeks is something about visas. And so if you're an international student, we have lots of students asking and concerned about, can I still study in the US? Can I get to the US? If I apply to school in the US, can I go? And so the specific question usually is, has the changing political climate in the United States made it harder or easier for international students to come to the US? The answer is it's made it much easier. The changing political climate has been huge. Recently, the US lifted the travel restrictions for students coming from countries like Brazil, where the travel ban actually remains in place. So if you are a student who gets accepted to US college, as long as you have a visa, which our office is very good at helping you figure out how to get, even during this really difficult time, you can travel to the United States as long as you have a student visa to study, even if there's a travel ban.
Yes, and what I would also add to that is from this past cycle, we really learned a lot, and we were side by side with our students as so much ebbed and flowed and as things were really rapidly changing over this past year. And what we saw from universally, colleges and universities across the states was at every step a true commitment to their students that they'd admitted. So we saw colleges pull out all of the stops that they could to support their students. So I feel really confident in what we did see in this last year from colleges, that they want international students and they're gonna do everything they can to get you there.
Great. So I just saw a great question just came in. If applying early decision is not an option, what would you recommend to make the application of a student stand out?
I think we should both answer this, Megan.
Yeah.
So I can kick this off. This is like my area here. So just to start, I would say it's always important to show interest, demonstrate your interest to the college, even if early decision is not an option. There's other ways that you can do this. So you can, during safe times, you can visit campus. You can go on a campus tour. You can go to an information session. You can actually go to class on campus. I think that's really useful because in the application, then you can say, I sat in on Miss Stetson's class and I learned X, Y, and Z. And now I just like really want to go to Harvard. And so, you know, you can say it better than that. But the point is, if you engage with the campus specifically, they will have a track record of you attending these different events. And that shows that you're more likely to actually attend that college if you're accepted. So that's number one, is show your interest. Interviewing also falls into that. Number two is, we've talked about this a lot. The word impact has come up in this presentation a lot. And I would say a way to stand out is to figure out if that is something you want to do. If you're looking at a top school, they're looking for top applicants. And so do you want to make an impact in this world, in this community, at your school? If the answer is yes, then you should start brainstorming ways that you can make an impact, that you can enforce change and growth and, you know, social entrepreneurship, if you may. And so that's important. Find that project, find that impact you want to do. The last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Megan is, it's really beneficial to, if you have the time, and this is early enough in your high school career, to think about attending a summer program at the school of your dreams, or the schools of your dreams. You will be able to talk more eloquently about the school and why you like it. And you will also have visited that school. Therefore, in the school's mind, and likely true, making you more likely to actually attend that school if you're accepted.
So I have a couple of things to say. One is, someone just added to this, what if we're an international student and we can't visit? So you actually can do virtual visits now. And of course, it's not the same, but there are enormous resources available online that you can use. And then there's actually a place on your application where you can say, I did a virtual tour. So there's actually a way for you to report that to the school. So everything counts. So that's to answer that piece. And then additionally, there's also early action, I would say. So if you're in a position where you're, I don't know where this question is coming from in terms of not in a position to be able to apply early decision. But essentially what we're doing at Logic Prep is always trying to maximize strategic opportunities with our students. So if I don't know where the question is coming from, but I would work with this student to say, like, okay, let's find 10 early action schools, or like what other options do we have? And early action is not binding, so it doesn't increase your chances quite as much, but it increases your chances more than regular.
I think there is a really good question about early decision, so I'd love to address that quickly also. The question is, should early decision, we call it ED, by the way, so should ED be a tool to reach for a harder and harsher school, or to secure a spot in a more attainable goal? Again, this is a question we get like every week and every year. Megan, do you want to try to answer this?
Yeah, this is the question, the question for the ages. So the answer is, as every answer is in this field, it does depend, and it's a very delicate balance. So I'm always, what I want as an advisor is for my student to be successful and be at the best college they can end up at. So if the student is coming to me with a reach that I think is too far out of reach, I'm going to tell that student, I think that might be a waste of the early shot. But there's gradation. So in the top 10, 20, 30 schools, those are all amazing places. So that is the delicate balance of it's yes, finding a reach, but one that's within reach, like a within reach, not the highest high reach.
Let's see. So there's a couple of very specific questions here. And if they are kind of specific to you, we actually will probably reach out privately and answer those. So feel free to keep typing those and we'll tackle. There is one, go for it, Lindsay.
No, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of questions that are sort of thematically related about
Yep,
how do
yep.
I know whether to submit scores, essentially, like how do I know what good enough is? So maybe we can address a variety of those questions that have surfaced kind of through that lens.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about when our score is additive, certainly. And so let's go ahead and address that now. Thank you, Lindsay. So how do I know whether to submit my test score is the question of the year and also the question of the next 2 years, probably. So we recommend that students look to the middle 50% of what, I guess, like, how do you explain this, Megan? Can you explain this better than me? The middle 50% of the students that submit scores.
So yeah, we basically, the answer to this is we do use statistics in this conversation. And so what we look at is of the prior year's admitted class, so if I'm applying to Wharton, I'm looking at last year's admitted class to Wharton. What was the middle 50% of their SAT or ACT scores? So of the class admitted, 25% scored higher than that band and 25% scored lower than that band. So we want our students to be at least in this middle band or higher. So that's how we start the conversation. We might also include, okay, what's the breakdown? Like if you're applying to engineering, we want to make sure you have the math score that's in the middle 50% band or higher. So it can get even more nuanced than that.
I did want to answer, I was trying to type this out and I think it's just too difficult of an answer. So I want to answer the question that says, like, what are the top schools that give full financial aid to international students? I think that's a really, really good question. And I have 2 ways of answering this. The first one is the most selective schools in the country also tend to be the most helpful, most financially supportive schools in the country. And so that means you're looking at the Harvards, the UChicagos, the Stanfords, the schools like that. And also in the liberal arts world, you can look at Colgate or Williams, Skidmore, things along those lines. They will offer financial aid to international students. I will give you a caveat to this. If the school is financial need blind, which means they don't see how much money you need to attend, they're more likely to give financial aid to international students. That's the first caveat. The second one is if they are not need blind, they save the majority of their financial aid for local domestic US students. And so just know that, and there's ways to research that, and we can talk offline if you want to shoot me an email. We can talk a little bit more about that one. The other answer is, and maybe Megan or Lindsay can talk a little bit more about this too. The other answer is that the larger schools in the United States, many of them state schools, have very specific scholarships for academics. And so these are not financial aid, these are academic scholarships. And if you are excited or willing to go to a school that may not be the Harvards or the Stanfords, but still an amazingly wonderful school academically, you can apply for an internal scholarship at that school as an international student, and they do not change who they give those scholarships to based on where you're located.
Great, thank you all. I'm just scanning through the chat here. It does seem that most of the questions that remain are pretty specific. So I would encourage anyone who has a question that we haven't addressed that pertains more to them personally to follow up via email. We will also be reaching out with a follow-up of kind of summarizing this presentation. And if you guys would like to book any follow-up meetings or discussions to kind of more individually delve into all of this, the 3 of us are certainly happy to chat.
Lindsay, one question for you. One of the questions that we didn't answer is like, how do we register for Logic Prep? And so I'm wondering if you want to just talk about that for a second.
Well, I will be sending a note to all of you and we can chat from there, I would say, or send me an email, just lindsay@logicprep.com, and we can start the conversation about what a program would look like that would be most supportive for you. So anyway, I'm very excited and to have had the opportunity to speak with you all tonight, and very much look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you for the thoughtful questions and for being here with us.